So good morning, everyone. Really nice to be here. Thanks to ARM for having us in this room this morning, and obviously my lovely guests that are joining us as well. So throughout the meeting, I hope you've all been paying attention, but most of the talk, the discussions, the key takeaways from those panels and the presentations has been the power of collaboration and to have partnerships within the business that we are in, which is to make sure that we're serving the patients, which is, ultimately what we should all be investing ourselves in, to make sure that the patients are going to receive these fantastic therapies. And, every year I come to a conference, there's more galvanizing and rejuvenating of the topic of everyone coming together and making sure that we're hitting those milestones for those patients. So I'm Kelly Frend. I'm at World Courier. I'm the Senior Personalised Supply Chain Manager. I've been with World Courier for almost 19 years, so I started when I was about this big. And I've worked my way through customer service. Through being in customer service, I got into booking shipments for cell and gene therapy, going out and seeing the customers for cell and gene therapy, bone marrow, immunotherapies. So it piqued my interest, and then in 2017 we had a service line dedicated for cell and gene therapies. And through that, Simon Ellison, he then pulled me more into the world of cell and gene therapy, hence now why I'm attending conferences. Well, not only attending, I'm working at the conference, right? So for this morning. And that has led me to more interesting topics. And so for today, I've got a good mix, a good crowd of people that we're going to talk around these types of collaborations. So I will hand over to Mimi so you can introduce a little bit about your background and where you are now.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. And it's so lovely to be here with so many esteemed colleagues in the space of cell and gene and ATMPs. Mimi Choon-Quinones. I'm based in Lugano, Switzerland, and have spent over 26 years in the pharma industry at Merck, Novartis, and Roche. And in all those years when I was working in industry, I was also volunteering as a patient advocate, supporting patients and families get access to the highest delivery of care, which includes a timely diagnosis and, of course, access to innovative therapies and treatment options. And today, I do spend about 60% of my time volunteering to support cell and gene patients across the world, but very proud to share that we have an African Union and Pan-African Parliament and Africa Medicine Agency's official partnership where we could represent cell and gene therapy patients and families across all 55 countries on the continent of Africa, and have cleared the regulatory pathway for ATMPs and cell and gene therapies to arrive. So the power of partnership means that we generously and kindly invite you to join us on this endeavor, because it's going to be a long road ahead, but a fulfilling role to support the patients in Africa because they are left behind. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, Diego.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks, Mimi and Killian, for participating in this very timely panel, to Cencora and World Courier for the invitation. My name is Diego Correa. I'm the Vice President and Global Head of a Cell and Gene Therapy Center of Excellence, IQVIA. I'm a physician scientist, and before joining IQVIA, I spent almost 20 years in academia developing cell and gene therapy platforms from preclinical all the way to translational into clinical alternatives. This is our life. This is our dream, trying to establish partnerships, meaningful partnerships with as many entities as possible. Everything is just envisioning the benefit for the patients. That ultimately is what motivates us to move forward.
Killian.
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and thanks to Kelly for the opportunity to be part of this panel. So I'm Killian Kelly. I'm the CEO and Managing Director of Cynata Therapeutics, which is a a biotech company based in Melbourne, Australia. So we're developing iPSC-derived mesenchymal stem cell products for a range of indications. We've got several clinical programs ongoing. I've been with the company for almost 10 years. I've been working in the cell and gene therapy space for a few years longer than that. My original background, I qualified as a pharmacist and did a Ph.D. in pharmaceutical sciences and then worked in big pharma, but I gradually found my way into the CGT space, which is, I think, very exciting from a scientific point of view, but also really very rewarding, because I think we are all collectively working on meeting unmet needs for all sorts of very serious diseases where currently patients have very poor outcomes. So it's a really exciting field to be part of, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Excellent, thank you very much. So, seems, all of these thoughts about all these things we should be doing earlier in the supply chain, thinking about who is it that we're going to bring on board, who are we going to partner with, what sort of advice can be given in those early stages. And so, it's not just thinking about the reimbursements and the health economics and looking at that long vision. It is, actually, I've got this fantastic product, but how am I going to move it from A to B? What situation are we in as far as where the sites are located? Are there any risks associated around those sites as far as access for flights, ground transport, etc.? That will feature more as we move out of the territories that we're already operating within, right? That have a good network set up for flights, for ground vehicles, for, employees, whether direct or indirect, that can obviously support those things. And when we were talking, Killian, you brought up your project during COVID. And the setup for Australia. So if you can tell us a little bit about the challenges that you faced there, but also where the partnership came in to help overcome.
Sure. Yeah. So, look, I'm sure everybody knows that during COVID there were all sorts of challenges in daily life, never mind trying to deliver a complex therapy. But we had a trial in patients who were admitted to ICU with acute respiratory distress syndrome as a consequence of COVID. And our product is a cryopreserved allogeneic product. So it's stored in the vapor phase of liquid nitrogen. It has to be shipped in a liquid nitrogen dry shipper. And typically what we might do for a clinical trial is have the product stored locally at the hospital, and then it's handled from there. But during COVID, we had a real challenge because the ICUs were pretty much isolated from the rest of the hospital, and the staff were obviously having to wear PPE, and they weren't allowed to move freely from one part of the hospital to another. So even though the centres participating in this trial, in theory, had access to this type of storage, it really wasn't accessible to the ICU. So we had to try and put some sort of solution in place where we could actually get this product to the patient. And remember that these patients aren't planning to come into ICU. They deteriorated quickly. They were admitted. We had to administer the product very soon, within like 24 hours of them being admitted to ICU. And so we worked with World Courier actually to try and figure out how we could do this. And we came up with a solution with World Courier where they, it was, to be honest, it was a bit of a workaround, but they used these shippers, which are really intended just for transport from A to B. But we had this kind of continuous system set up where we had 3 shippers that were always kind of ready to go, and 2 of them had product in them, and every week or so those shippers have to be kind of recharged with liquid nitrogen, and so they'd move product from one shipper to another. And then the other part of it was, of course, getting it to the site as soon as possible once a patient was in. So there was procedures put in place where if there was a request put in, even up to about 4 p.m. on one weekday, that the product could be at the ICU prior to 8 a.m. the next day for an infusion. And so it was, clearly a very kind of complex setup and very different to how somebody might normally supply a product for a clinical trial. But, we made it work, and we didn't have a single case in that trial where the product did not get to the patient in time. And so that was, I think, a really great example where us as a small biotech company with limited people, and we don't have these resources ourselves, but we were able to work with World Courier to try and figure something out that was really not even what World Courier would normally do.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. That's an unusual situation, which obviously COVID was unusual all the way through. But that comes back to, having that early discussion and saying, look, this is what we want to do.
Yeah.
How are we going to achieve it? Have you got any ideas? This is what I was thinking. And then perhaps maybe then someone else says, oh, hold on a minute. Why don't we just hold on to a couple of units or deliver one in, swap them out, and have that continuous turnaround of those.
And that's exactly right. And, I have to say at the starting point, we did have people in the team kind of saying, oh, this can't be done. It's, the ICU doesn't have access to the storage in the hospital. We're not going to be able to do it. And it is important to say, well, it's something that we don't currently know how to do, but let's try and talk to the people who really do this for a living and see if they can kind of come up with some sort of a solution. And that's what we did.
And then models can change, right? So as things progress, perhaps maybe timelines can be squeezed because, manufacturing times come down, and actually you can then move those products before the QP release, so almost in parallel, so that they're within either region or the domestic setting. So actually then it's a fairly quick turnaround to get it to the site. And Diego, you came up with an interesting collaboration or a setting, which Cell and Gene, I think, is probably one of the most collaborative and open, and we want people to move through the challenges that we had without the pitfalls, perhaps maybe that we might have had in the early days. And you had an interesting experience for a Boston Breakfast Club, was it?
So basically what Keelan was mentioning is just a description of the multiple challenges that cell and gene therapy normally entails. That we at IQVIA, we try to divide it like in 4 different buckets. One of them is just the asset in itself, the science, the patients, the manufacturing, delivery, and finally the clinical development process in itself, which is super nuanced and challenging. So from the first one, in terms of the asset and in terms of the science, that it's highly evolving. And we have seen in this conference that there's all the time new technologies coming out for the market. And of course, each one of them brings its own challenges. We know that this is once and done in most of the cases, not MSCs. And I'm an MSC person as well. I did also a trial in ARDS with MSCs at the University of Miami just before joining IQVIA. We faced similar challenges, although it was an investigator-initiated trial, so it was a little bit easier, I would suspect. But of course, it's most of the times it's just once and done, and there's no way back. And based on this, you have to face potential acute, subacute toxicities, and most importantly, delayed toxicities, which is actually something that is critical for us when we're picturing years ahead, and we derive this long-term follow-up that are required. In terms of the patients, we know oncology, rare diseases, small cohorts of patients, not well understood diseases, all these brings significant challenges, especially for the gene therapy side of things. Then manufacturing, logistics, it's expensive, it's time consuming. Most of the times it's very difficult to have all these components from a supply chain in the same place, complex administration routes, CNS, cardiovascular. All these are challenges that we normally take into consideration when
a little bit stressful is what you're saying.
It is. But thankfully, via different collaborations that we can actually discuss here, we kind of mitigate some of these multiple challenges. And then the clinical development in itself, recruitment of the required patients, identification of the sites that have the infrastructure, the expertise, the accreditation to run these trials, the long-term follow-up, the logistics, et cetera. So one of the things that is interesting in terms of partnerships, and you were bringing this Boston Breakfast, is we are extremely interested in gene editing, as it's been pictured as the driver of cell and gene therapy by 2030. So multiple companies in the Boston-Cambridge area that are collectively thinking about how to advance gene therapy and specific gene editing, they actually just get together and brainstorm about potential solutions. Because there's so many nuances, so many different difficulties that regulators do not know how to address potential toxicities in the gene editing space. So this tells me even they are might be competitors, quotes and quotes, they get together and try to put their brains together, just try to address some of these present challenges that they have specifically in gene editing.
Excellent. So Mimi, coming at it from the patient advocacy side, what sort of collaborations do you think, whether they are in place now or that you would like to see in the future to help give access to all, right? So part of your website is the explanation that, you know, we should all have access to health. It should be equal, it should be diverse, right? And so having that inclusion, how do we make sure through collaborations, which you may have already started, how are we going to make sure that we achieve that and give that access to all?
Thank you so much for that question. And so if we all close our eyes and imagine a perfect world that, you know, we live in, especially in the world of cell and gene, it is that it doesn't matter where a patient lives, where the patient was born, that they have access to the innovation and even standard of care, even if the standard of care is a combination between generic and brand. So if we close our eyes and can envision that, we can open our eyes and kind of look around the room and see that we could do this together. There's no perfect solution. But for now, the best that we have, at least in the space of advocacy, especially at Partners for Patients, we're a Swiss headquartered organization, but we are also registered in all 55 African countries and in multiple high-income countries, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and Germany. We have this neutral opportunity to have a neutral platform, and that includes industry collaborations. So we have a majority of the bigger pharma organizations that's working together with us for insights gathering, right? So we have what we call resonance meetings, and that helps. Does this sound about right? Are we going in the right track? Are we off track? Bring us back on track. What are the guardrails? So we have industry. We're very, very privileged to have every single parliamentarian across the entire African continent as a part of our consortium. And with an office inside the Pan-African Parliament, inside the African Union, Partners for Patients, NGO has an opportunity to write model laws together with the lawmakers. So I'm a legally trained mind, so as a lawyer, I have the opportunity to work with many different lawyers across the industry to help write model laws so that they can infiltrate into the actual nations. We also have a long-standing partnership with EMA. We have a long-standing partnership with the European Parliament. We have a long-standing relationship with ICER, and those are the what we call stakeholders. And then of course, most important, but equally as important is all of our patients and our caregivers in the society. Our academics, our researchers are a part of our knowledge sharing, insights gathering. So we could go further together, but as you can imagine, the rules and the regulations nationally could hinder us. So we have been proud to break open the doors and set pathways for cell and gene, where every single cell and gene therapy, when they come into Africa now, we now have cleared tax exemption legislation. So if you come into Africa now, and if you have a cell and gene therapy, you will be tax exempt. Our MOU and our partnership includes that you also will have an opportunity to work directly with not only the lawmakers, but also with the patients, with the families, with the African Medicines Agency, so that we could knowledge share. So for us, this at the moment is where we're at. The ideal state is all cell and gene therapy partners have an opportunity to be the voice at the table. So as you can imagine, your voices are so important. We don't have all of your insights, so the best would be an invitation for you, your colleagues, or anyone you know, patients, families, anyone in the system, the hospitals, the academics, the researchers, if they have a desire to work in this space of a very, very difficult environment, which is Africa, we do have at least an environment and a platform that's neutral where we could share knowledge together and learn together. So we're able to facilitate this and coordinate this, but it takes everyone's time.
Yep.
And time is valuable and a commodity. So we're not asking you to lose time, but potentially when you give the time, it's exponential and cumulative that you could advance further when we're working together. I hope that answers your question.
Perfect. So I was just going to come back to Diego and ask, when you're looking at because obviously you've got a huge background in clinical trials generally, but also now being within this field, bringing that overall experience forward, and the partners that you work with, Courier and others. How early is it that maybe you would be engaged with PAGs, or when is it that you would bring in a logistics company, or that you would advocate for those things to be part of the discussion?
That's an interesting question, Kelly. And as a matter of fact, we always say the earlier, the better. And of course, with what Mimi was mentioning, for us in IQVIA our partnership with the PAGs is critical, because we need to find those patients. Because we were saying before, one of the biggest challenges in cell and gene therapy is the small cohort of patients, and try to find them is difficult. And PAGs has been always one of the routes of preference of us is to establish a relationship. And we actually have an office within IQVIA that dedicates solely to the relationship with the PAGs. And based on that, we'll tap into those resources and we'll be able to find patients that otherwise will be extremely complicated to find. So whenever we engage with a sponsor, we have a process that we call pain points, in which we understand the sponsor, what are the needs, what are the expectations, what are the timelines of this particular sponsor. And based on that, we react. Of course, logistics comes number one, patient recruitment, site ID, regulatory. And we have support in all these instances and avenues. But what is interesting is that logistics is one of the key issues based on the fact that it impacts not only early development, but late development and commercialization.
Yeah.
So it is critical to think for the sponsors, and I'm sure, Killian, you have had these thoughts in the past, which is the early decisions you make are gonna have a significant impact later on. So we try to communicate with the sponsor very early about all these topics, trying to move forward and set up a pathway that is gonna be successful for 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Understanding that most of these sponsors, and depending on the types of therapy, requires long-term follow-ups. And we are already set up to help these sponsors navigate that complicated time of extended safety and durability. So again, summarizing, the earlier, the better. And we always have these conversations at the first time we meet with our sponsors.
Awesome. Glad to hear it.
Yeah.
And Killian, for you, coming from, you've got a reasonably small setup, right? So you've got partners that you're outsourcing to. Obviously, you've already explained the example for Australia, but will that be used as you move into the next trial, making sure that you have those conversations and how you apply those lessons that we've already learned?
Absolutely. You're right. We're a very small company, and we rely very heavily on outsourcing all sorts of things. Even your standard business type activities like finance and legal, everything. So we rely very heavily on partners. And I think when we come to any new project, I totally agree with Diego. It's the earlier the better. And I think in addition to kind of applying the lessons that we internally have learned from our previous trials, I think a real advantage for us in working with partners like IQVIA or World Courier or whoever it is that we get to benefit from the lessons that they've learned, right? Now, obviously, any service provider has confidentiality obligations and so on, but they don't need to tell us the confidential details of their previous experience. They can just anticipate, well, have you thought about this? Well, is this a risk? Have you thought about putting in this sort of mitigation or this solution? And that's extremely valuable because, to be honest, even if we were a bigger company, our experience would clearly be relatively limited, right, just to the projects that we have run ourselves. And so being able to kind of capitalize on that much broader experience, I think is very valuable. And I think, you know, logistics, I think, certainly is a big part of it, and regulatory is a big part of it. I think when I think about cell and gene therapy trials, in comparison to trials with, you know, conventional drugs or monoclonal antibodies, which I've been involved in the past, you know, every clinical trial has challenges, right? And some of them are common regardless of the treatment modality. But I think the most unique parts of the challenges when it comes to cell and gene therapies tend to be with logistics and regulatory, because you know, the regulations are, you know, the regulators are trying to kind of set their expectations still for these products. They're kind of, you know, trying to adapt to the changing landscape themselves. And so we still have, you know, first of all, changing expectations, which is a challenge in itself, but also a complete lack of harmonization across the world. And you know, Mimi's obviously talking about Africa, but even in the so-called developed world, we have very different regulatory expectations, even within Europe, where we supposedly have you know, the same regulations applying across the whole European Union. We have different regulatory authorities in different member states applying them differently. And so that, I think...
Sometimes even within regions, each country.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So
in Spain.
Yeah, so you know, these things I think are, you know, I'm not saying there's no regulatory challenges in, you know, biologics, for example, but I think it's amplified in the cell and gene therapy space. And again, that's where I think working with partners really helps, because you know, we will work with CROs or regulatory consultants and so on who've built up a bit of experience, and they can kind of, again, without breaching confidentiality, kind of say, look, we think that this regulatory authority in Spain or whatever might be starting to ask these sorts of questions. So we should think about those before we even put our submission in, because once you submit, you tend to have a very short time to answer any questions that comes up. So really, you kind of, in an ideal world, you want to have all of that kind of, you know, have those questions addressed before you submit if you can, but that's never going to happen entirely, but you know, that's what you're trying to aim for. So yeah, I think the, you know, tapping into that expertise and doing it as early as possible is, you know, it's absolutely essential.
And so Mimi, for the PAGs, do you proactively follow what's happening within the cell and gene landscape and reach out to the pharma companies and, you know, ask where is it that they're looking to, you know, select their sites? Or are you in any way able to help in that selection process, or because you would be aware of patients and you're advocating on where they are, and, you know, unfortunately the disease that they might be suffering from might not necessarily, as we are hearing throughout this conference, have that kind of access, or has it been thought of? Do you have that kind of involvement or collaboration with the pharma companies or CROs? Do you get involved at that point?
Thank you so much for that question. So the answer is yes. I've had, you know, the honor and the privilege to serve at ARM, overseeing EU regulatory. And so for me, having this experience and having the experience in my pharma world, you know, pharma days, as well as working with the regulators like EMA and of course, you know, multiple different regulators, we understand what's happening in the cell and gene space. And we call this like the bridge, right? The tension and the compressions of bridge we understand well. And so we're able to communicate this, not only to our patients and to the families, but also what the patients and families want to say about how they value a treatment option. For example, in a high-income country like the United States or Canada, what they value, we like to be able to translate that. And in this process, we've been able to give birth to a program called cross-border clinical trials. So we've been working with a pharma company who's in the space of SMA, and they have been bringing their patients from either low middle income countries or even a high income country that doesn't have a site available very close by for the patient. We've been able to help inform the logistics of replanting the family from their home country to the country or to the city where that clinical trial's at. Mostly they're high income countries. metropolitan areas, very, very expensive cities to live in near academic sites. And so the pharma company, in partnership with grants, gets the families through the clinical trial for the 5 years or 7 years, all the way to follow-up, post-follow-up, clinical trial access. So we've been able to help with what we call cross-border clinical trials, and this has been an enormously, enormously challenging space. There are a lot of regulations, but as a lawyer, and we have an entire legal team of 10 at our PAG, we're able to work through a lot of those nuances. So while we're getting Africa ready for clinical trials, there's also intercontinental and intracontinental cross-border clinical trial recruitment opportunities that we're very proud to be a part of. But our limitation is, of course, knowledge in the spaces of what's in the future. What would regulators say yes or no to in the future? We all don't know. So we're trying to help shape those policies and directives and guidelines. We're also limited with number of folks that can do this. So we are relying heavily on pro bono and volunteers because we are 100% self-funded for the last 33 years, and we're 100% volunteer-based, volunteering for SDG goals 1, 2, 3, and 4. So with that, we're also recruiting volunteers to help because there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
And we could do some, but we can't do all without partnerships.
We can't do it on our own,
That's
right?
right.
So that is, another part of the message, and coming back to the partnerships and the challenges that we face, or use our experience to make sure that those challenges can be overcome. Lessons have been learned, early discussions, and coming from the background of logistics and organising shipments, customs, airlines, handlers, etc. We are not just that, we'll go from there and we'll deliver it there and that's that, and that's all we have to worry about. And that's coming back to the point of those early conversations, because that's something we need to think about, because there's cost implications, right? If we've got a site that perhaps maybe is now going to involve, a 10-hour drive because there's not a flight on a Thursday, but the patient is going to need to have their apheresis done on a Thursday. So that's where our experience is going to be coming in there. And we're not just a transport company, we are part of a healthcare company. Cencora is driven by making sure these patients receive these therapies or other products, across the board. We want to make sure that they're being connected, and you can have a great therapy, but if you cannot move that and get that into the facility to the patient, then what is it actually worth? That patient then doesn't have that curable, life-saving, life-altering dose. So, everyone coming together has that ability to change the outcome for that patient, or the accessibility for that patient. And when I'm thinking about and I'm having discussions with customers is, putting those thoughts in the mind, right? We have all either been touched by these terrible diseases, and what kind of ideal world would it be if we could just say, they said on a panel the other day, if you were in there, is you could just walk downstairs and you pick up your vial and that's it, and then you have your treatment. Wouldn't that be a great state to be in? And one of the things that we also do, or that I've been a part of, is to actually share the knowledge, isn't it? Share what works in the partnership. So, we've been linking up with airlines to have workshops, discussions, and make them aware what it is that is moving through those lines, that you're putting that then onto the aircraft, taking it off, and then we're coming in to recover it at the other end. And, it has to be that it is the right shipment, the right temperature, delivered at the right time. And I'm not saying things don't go wrong. That's why I have white hair. There are huge challenges when it comes to working with, airlines, customs, but preparing and mitigating as many of those risks as possible is what we should all be aiming to do together. So, as part of your work within the African region, have airlines, customs, etc., that's all been part of the sharing and the collaborations that you've been doing, right?
The answer is yes. We're in discussions with a partnership with the South African Airlines, but Ethiopian Airlines is another partner. They absolutely deliver. I'm very, very pleased with their services and discussions. It's not final, but yes, so on the African continent, but also with Delta Airlines, they take huge pride in becoming as circular economy as possible. So their sustainability and go green models work a lot with, you know, the values that we live by. So yes, we are in touch with airlines as well.
Yeah.
But probably not as far as you, Kelly. So
Yeah.
we'd love to learn and partner.
Don't go there. Yeah. And Killian, for you, you were saying earlier about some of the unique things that you're actually doing to encourage, you know, the Indigenous.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it's a similar sort of challenge to what Mimi has talked about, but perhaps on a lesser scale. We're not moving families to different countries or anything, but we're running a trial in patients with diabetic foot ulcers, and just the way, I guess, the demographics work in Australia in particular, we have the major treatment centres tend to be in, you know, urban areas, large urban centres, but the prevalence of that disease tends to be more in the kind of outer suburban areas or regional areas, and there's also a particularly high incidence in Australian Indigenous people, where there's a much higher rate of diabetes, for example, which then also obviously predisposes to diabetic foot ulcer, and so we have a situation where we have the treatment centres being really quite far away in many cases from where the patients live, and obviously that's a major barrier for us in terms of getting patients into the trial, but it's also a major barrier for the patients in getting appropriate care. So what we've tried to do in that trial is you know, bring in initiatives like you know, paying for transport for the patients and their caregiver, if applicable, to come to the urban treatment centre and attend those visits. We've got nurses who will go out to the patient's home to do some of the visits there. You know, we've tried to design the protocol in such a way that, you know, there are certain parts of the trial that really have to happen at the site, but certain parts don't, right? So in a diabetic foot ulcer trial, one of the things that needs to be done is, you know, changing of dressings, for example, and that's something that a nurse can do in a patient's home if we can get the nurse there, right? So we're, obviously putting those in place in the trial to try and, you know, make the trial accessible to the patients, which is, you know, ultimately it's mutually beneficial. It gets the patients, you know, the care, and there's a major problem with diabetic foot ulcers where, unfortunately, a lot of people with this condition don't get adequate care, and we can actually see that very clearly in these trials, including in ours so far, where patients in the control group do much better than patients in real life. And the reason for that is because in the trial, they're actually getting seen by a nurse twice a week. And so they're actually getting proper care, which shows that actually part of the problem it's not just a lack of good treatment, it's actually a lack of access to basic health care as well. And now, I have to say that the improvement in the control patients isn't particularly, you know, dramatic, and that's not going to solve the problem. So there's certainly a need for our, you know, innovative therapies as well. But clearly, you know, it highlights the point that we could complete this trial, for example. Let's hope this is what happens, and we show fantastic efficacy, and all of the diabetic foot ulcers heal. But if we can't, I think you mentioned it earlier, Kelly, if we can't get that treatment to the patients, well, what's the point, right? Nobody's going to benefit from it. So I think we have to address this in clinical trials for a start in order to be able to, you know, effectively execute the trials. But we've also got to think about it in the longer term, and I think this is really what Mimi's all about, is like, let's imagine these products are approved and on the market. How is the healthcare system going to ensure that everybody actually has access to these treatments? Because not everybody lives down the street from, you know, a world-leading medical facility. You know, that's the reality. Most people don't live anywhere near these places, and that is even the case in developed countries, like certainly in Australia, and I'm sure the same is true in the US as well. I guess in more densely populated countries in Europe, it's probably a bit different. More people are probably within easier reach, but in these kind of bigger land masses, you know, there's a lot of people that are a long way away from these major centres, and I think that's a problem that, you know, needs to be addressed more widely.
Yep, even in a tiny island like the UK, you know, you can be coming from the southwest and you'll have to go into London.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a big pull on the families, right?
It is, and
huge
especially when people are, you know, they have a serious health problem, right? Getting, and with diabetic foot ulcers as an example, you know, some of these people find it very difficult to just get out of their house. It's, you know, they've got these painful ulcers on their feet. They've got other medical problems as well. So, you know, that exacerbates it as well. So I think that's, you know, as I said, there's we as trial sponsors can do certain things within trials, but, you know, ultimately that's a wider issue that society has to address.
Streamlining is to, you know, have those patients on board to make sure it's a success. So then the access is there. And Diego, sorry, you were going to...
Yeah, I mean, it's just to emphasize and elaborate a little bit further on this, is that we sometimes tend to forget the patients and the caregivers. What is exactly the toll that all these therapies have in caregivers? For instance, and this is part of our experience in CAR T cells. I don't know if you guys are aware, but basically when a patient is actually enrolled in a CAR T and he gets the treatment, he has to live for 6 months within a few miles from a center, just for potential acute, subacute, and chronic toxicities. So that person typically doesn't live by himself or herself, so it has to be in the whole family. So what we are doing is that we're taking this very seriously and partnering, again, emphasizing the concepts of partnership with different vendors that actually provide concierge services for patients, for families, because this is a critical element. I mean, and they're extremely disrupting therapies, not only for the patient, but also for the families. So we have to be fully aware of this. And I'm very intrigued and interested in the concept of Africa, because this is something that at IQVIA we are taking very seriously. And we have a unit called Democratization of Clinical Trials. And we're trying to just bring clinical trials to latitudes that otherwise would be very difficult. Latin America, Asia Pacific, Africa. And of course, as you may imagine, the challenges are enormous. Not only finding these patients, and here what Mimi does is actually essential. It is a cornerstone for bringing these trials to these populations. But also the secondary issues. Where are the sites, the logistics? What are the experience and expertise from a medical perspective? For instance, you're doing a gene therapy for a neurodegenerative disease, and the application is intracisterna magna. Who's going to do that? Do you have the right equipment? Do you have the right facilities? So this has all sort of different functions and different factors that need to be incorporated into this equation. But I'm interested in talking to you because this is something that we are actually exploring heavily within IQVIA.
I'm glad to hear that, Diego.
Absolutely.
Mimi, you're here for the rest of the day, right? So Diego will catch you before you leave the stage and can go through that with you. But again, for you, Diego, as a CRO, you're seeing various different projects, various different size customers coming to you, and you know, what sort of view do you have on the types of challenges, or perhaps maybe even some missteps that might have happened that you are then using to make sure that those companies can move through those clinical trials as successfully as possible?
Well, that's an interesting question. And of course, we have to recognize what is the demographics of sponsors in cell and gene therapy. And despite the fact that as a representation in large caps, mid-size, and EVPs, as the cell and gene therapy space is maturing, most of the companies, up to 60 or 70%, are EVPs. I mean, really small companies like, for example, Synata, that are just trying to navigate these development processes. And they have different challenges than large caps. For instance, tight budgets, very restricted timelines. I mean, very strict deadlines and restrictions that makes every single decision absolutely critical. So basically what IQVIA has done in the past few years is understand those needs and accommodate One of the single most questions, or the single most question I get from sponsors is, how can you assure me that I'm not going to get lost in a 90,000 people company? But what we did is just incorporate the model of the biotech. It is called IQVIA Biotech. And it's another business unit within IQVIA to access to all the resources that we have, but it's specifically designed to address the nuances, the challenges that small biotechs have. And as a matter of fact, in our portfolio, we can say that up to 86% of our companies that we deal with are companies of 20 people or fewer. And they have very specific challenges that other companies do not have. So basically what we're trying to do as a CRO is try to understand their needs and address them accordingly. And this IQVIA Biotech model is actually very, very, very well received, and it's working quite positively.
Excellent. I mean, I remember a few years ago going in to see a customer in the UK, and they'd had a number of discussions, and it was leaning towards, we'll do this shipment here, that shipment over there, tie this one up over there, and then I need to get that returned. And it was all falling on them, but they were, maybe 6 people. So you're talking to the VP that's going and rolling in the clinical sites, but it's also trying to take care of logistics and other elements, which is, they should be doing the things that they should be doing, right? And you should have that partner come in and take care of those things. And fortunately, I was lucky enough to go in there at the right time. It was early. It was a number of players in there, and it was just, tell me what this challenge is, and I proposed a new solution, right? So
and also,
it alleviates that pressure.
Exactly. And one of the major differences also in these two sectors is that small biotechs typically don't have in-house capabilities for covering everything. Right? That means patient recruitment, site ID, KOL relationships, logistics management, etc. Some of the large caps, they may have some developed these capabilities, but sometimes they outsource. But these ones are typically demanding all this as a full service. Well, this is more functional services. So we try to be as flexible as possible to react and offer what we think the sponsors actually need, anticipating the potential external or future challenges that they're going to find moving from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 to BLA and post-commercialization. Yeah.
And so, Mimi, I know you said that you have pharma sitting in on these discussions with the patient advocacy group, but do you also have the smaller biotech companies that you are engaged with or that you seek out to make sure that you're helping them to navigate these challenges? Hopefully, because their product is going to go into a new area, right?
That's true. Yes. So we do. We have been contacted by 3 small biotech companies specifically to help raise awareness of the importance of what caregivers need. So caregivers in our world could be a nurse who's caring for the patient. We call our caregivers engaged family caregivers because they're the ones that have to be disrupted. Yeah. Their loss of productivity, right, isn't reflected on economic models when decision-making is happening with HTAs or with ICER. So we want to be able to capture and reflect what are their burdens and pain points so that it could be reflected eventually in decision-making. So we do have 3 small biotechs that we work with to help with this very important area of what patients, but most importantly, what caregivers value. But they're inconsistent because their budgets are also very different. And so we are 100% self-funded and volunteering to do the work we do. So we also are stretched sometimes with capacity, but we have never said no to any collaborator.
There's a will, there's a way.
That's come to us. So when there's a will, there's a way. The long-term partnerships mean a lot to us. And what I can say to you is we have over 25,000 patients in our repository that are in the space of cell and gene. So they have either had one opportunity to experience CAR T or some type of biospecific or BCMA. And of those 25,000-ish patients and families, everyone has come back to say that they have been able to build such a trusted relationship and partnership with their care team and with their, of course, innovative treatment partners by knowing intentions. And if there's nothing that you took away from what I've said today, which is fine, it's very early, last day, it is intention. Intention is huge, it's enormous, and it's key and pivotal and critical. So when working with patients and families, no matter where you are in your phase or journey currently, just know that this is felt, and when it's authentic, it's known. So what I feel from the space of cell and gene, everyone is in it with the right intention. So I leave you with thank you so much on behalf of our patients and families. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for World Courier for everything you do. World Courier is so, so near and dear to my heart in the days of Merck, Novartis, and Roche, right? But also IQVIA working with you on the functional model of monitoring for many, many years, and also learning what you do as well, Killian. Everyone in this room, everyone at this conference, and everyone here that I am so proud to be on the stage with, your intentions are right. So I believe that where you're going is absolutely in the right direction. So on behalf of patients and families, thank you so much.
Also, I don't really know what to say after that one, but we've got a little bit of time before we do a summary each, or indeed we ask another question towards each other. Does anyone have any questions for anyone that is sitting up here today? Don't be shy. I can barely see. No? Okay, no problem. So do we have any questions for each other before we do a little summary, before we leave to go and get a cup of coffee ourselves?
Let me think about it. I have thousands of questions, but...
I think there's a question.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Yes, one question.
I was just curious how often the topic of trust comes into your conversations and your planning. Because this is such a critical issue. So many people who have a child or who have lived with a rare disease or a serious disease, so many times we have been treated so badly and so many disappointments, and the trust just crumbles, and that's only magnified 1,000,000 times in our 2/3 developing world. So I just wondered about trust conversations with the people you work with.
I mean, definitely within, logistics and the teams that I work with, and that's not just for World Courier, it's part of Cencora. Trust is implicit, it's so important, for the colleagues that you work with, for the people that you're trying to help. If you don't trust in that handoff to the next person who's then going to be looking after that shipment, then, where do you go with that, right? You have to have that trust. And although there are challenges, right, I joke around that logistics is challenging. It is also fun, but it is also incredibly important to make sure that we are all coming together. We need to use the airlines, otherwise how are we going to move these shipments around? So we need to educate the airlines. We need to work with customs to help them understand, because these therapies are coming through, they're moving in credos or they're moving in dry shippers, and there might be limited information on this, and they're not necessarily going to understand exactly what is going on inside of that box or within that dewar, but just know that everything that does move, treat it with care, make sure that it is loaded on that flight. Otherwise, you might get a call or two afterwards. Mimi, I'll let you go next.
It's in most of our conversations, right? Even said or unsaid. And so it's very important. So thank you for asking that. Yes, agree, and yes, it's important. And often.
For us as a CRO, it's a critical thing. Trust is a critical thing because, as you may imagine, the relationship between a vendor and a sponsor goes beyond just be a client. We establish partnerships with our sponsors because we're going to be together for up to 15 years if it's a CAR team. So, of course, the teams that have to be associated very tightly between the sponsor, the clinical operations teams within IQVIA. So basically, in all of our conversations, that's what we try to build. Trust between the parties. I mean, that the pathways for exchanging information are free, that there's no hurdles, and because that's essential for the ultimate success of the sponsor, that in the end is going to be our success as well. So it's absolutely essential in this relationship.
And from my perspective, I mean, I agree with Diego on the necessity of trust between, you know, sponsors and vendors or service providers. But also, I can tell you it's something that commonly comes up when I talk to some of the clinical investigators, the physicians that are working on our clinical trials. And on this trip, you know, I'm here in the US from Australia, so I've taken the opportunity to visit some of our clinical investigators. And in the last week, 2 of them brought this exact issue up, and they made the point that the trust between them and their patients is absolutely essential. And when they recommend a clinical trial to a patient, the patient's decision is in many cases driven largely by the fact that they trust their doctor, and they trust that their doctor is making a recommendation that's best for them. And because of that, the clinicians need to be absolutely convinced that the trial is being done properly, that it is the right thing for their patients. And they often will make the point that, you know, I'm not going to enroll a patient in your trial if I don't think it's the right thing for the patient. And that's absolutely how it should be. And it's not in anybody's interest for them to not do that. So I think the trust at every part of the chain in these projects is vital. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got another question.
Not really a question, or really more of a comment. So for those of you who were here last year, there was a young man, he was 17, he was a butterfly disease patient, and after his talk, he was so inspirational. I saw him at the hallway here, and I'm gonna try not to cry when I say his story. So when I said thank you for your inspirational story, and he said to me and some of my colleagues who were there, he said, no matter what, please keep going. And he said, thank you for all that you do. And he as a patient trusts all of us as a scientific community. And he said, and we didn't even know about the challenges of 2023. That was 2022. And when he said that, it stuck with me. And so I wanted to share that, and hopefully that he inspires you as well as much as he inspired me that day. And so he made such an impact on me.
Yeah, it's all worth it, right? So
all worth it. I'm super tired right now. I'm very honest with you, but I am energized, and it's because of patients. And thank you to the speakers as well.
Thank you very much. I'll just give a quick summary, and then I've got a couple of quotes that I found on one of my walks whilst I was in San Diego. I had the joy of having a little bit of time, which doesn't normally happen, right? So obviously, you know, partnerships, collaboration, knowledge, leveraging experience, sharing that between all of the groups that are going to be involved in the journey of that, hopefully that product making it all the way through to commercial and reaching many, many more patients, you know, and that ultimately then means that health access for all, that patient that sits in the middle, which we were talking around when we had our warm-up conversation, shall we say, you know, and they are. And we were talking about the biotechs, weren't we? And it's like, well, you know, if we don't have the patients, we don't have any of these other things. And it is unfortunate that we are in this situation where they have these devastating diseases, but we can all do something about treating them for those diseases. So quite right, keep going. So as I was walking, it was by San Diego Airport, Spanish Landing, which Melissa, you probably know. And also from this whole conference, right, is hope that we should all have for the future, no matter how challenging, is to keep going, because there is hope. So the first quote is, cancer, there's hope. You know, nothing's ever a given, right? Our health isn't a given, you know, the treatments are never a given, but to have the choice, right? And for it not to be fourth or fifth line, for it to move up. So they don't have to go through these various other treatments before they hopefully get to the successful treatment that is going to cure them. So these are cancer survivor quotes from Spanish Landing. They've got a bronze model which sits in there, and you can walk around and it's got the plaques in there. So cancer is the most curable of all chronic diseases, and someone at some point has been treated for all types of cancer. So again, there is hope, right? And with appreciation to all cancer patients, physicians, scientists who have gone before us and present the treatments that are available. And that is Richard and Annette Block, cancer survivors. So that's my last words. So you guys, have you got anything that you would like to add on top of that before we finish? We've got a minute.
No matter where you're born or live, it shouldn't determine if you live or die.
Absolutely. There's always hope, and there's always hope because there's partnerships. There's a way to interact between the different groups independent from what we are. I mean, the 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah, and I think we've spoken about some challenges that we face in this industry, but I think a lot of these challenges are common to most, if not all of us, and there's a lot of collective knowledge about how to address these challenges, and I think that's where the partnerships and the collaboration can kind of help us all get to where we need to go.
Excellent. So thank you very much all for taking part, especially you, Mimi, flying in to make sure that you were able to take part today, and thank you for everyone to come in and listen to us all talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.